Sonic the Hedgehog has had a roller coaster of a ride since the infancy of 3D platformers, but there's one aspect that's often overlooked, and that's how Sega used the limitations of their hardware to portray Sonic in a 3D world. I think it's time we caught up with the blue blur. Welcome to Low Poly. Our journey begins in 1996 with a game called Sonic the Fighters. This would mark the first time anybody ever saw Sonic in 3D. This Sonic model consists of 1,238 tries. Despite its polygonal look, this Sonic model actually has a lot of detail. For instance, if you look at Sonic's hands, he has modeled fingers and thumbs. This is quite surprising for a Sonic model made in 1996. You'll also see that Sonic's arms and legs aren't actually joined to his body. This is pretty common in models made in 1996, and it's something I talked about in the Super Mario episode. So to save me repeating myself, I'd recommend giving that episode a watch too. A lot of the textures for this model are basically flat colors, all except for the buckles on Sonic's shoes. If we look at the wireframe for this model, we can see that those textures are basically just slapped on two squares. And not forgetting Sonic's eyes, which are also just a flat color with an illustration of Sonic's pupils. I remember seeing the models from this game in a magazine in 1996 and being quite impressed with them, and actually I still kind of am. But now let's move on to an even lower poly Sonic model. Now this Sonic model was used in 3 games over the Sega Saturn era. Those games being Sonic Jam, Sonic 3D Blast, and Sonic R. At just 286 tries, this is incredibly low poly. The textures are very basic, but that's kind of what you'd expect in 1996. Sonic Team bypassed making any real hands for this model, so he basically just has these spatula hands, which is all they really needed to be, I guess. What's really cool is they were able to use the least amount of polygons to portray Sonic's spikes. Sonic's unique design and silhouette would be lost without these features. They'd use textures to capture Sonic's facial expression and the buckles on his shoes. All in all, it's impressive they were able to capture Sonic's iconic design with so few polygons. It wouldn't be until 1998 that we would see not only Sonic's drastic change in design, but also a drastic change in console. The Dreamcast being a more powerful machine meant better Sonic models. Here we have a direct comparison between 2 Sonic models from the same game but 2 years apart. One from Sonic Adventure on the Dreamcast and one from Sonic Adventure DX on the Nintendo GameCube. Sonic on the Dreamcast boasts a 993 try poly count, while Sonic on the Nintendo GameCube adds a whole 1,000 more tries to that number. Now this is interesting because we can physically see where those extra polygons were spent. The most obvious place where extra polygons were placed is in Sonic's hands. Instead of one giant clump of a hand in the Dreamcast version, in the GameCube version, Sonic was given his fingers and thumbs. In the GameCube version, Sonic's shoes are actually more rounded now and match the art style of the game's artwork. The extra polygons spent in Sonic's face actually make it appear more rounded now. This can be seen around the ridges of Sonic's eyes that are now more rounded as opposed to angular. Not to mention Sonic's ears, which are now less pointy. Speaking of points, if we take a look at Sonic's spikes, a lot of new polygons were placed here too. This helps the spikes appear more curved as opposed to angular in the Dreamcast version. Every aspect of the DX model improves on what the Dreamcast model did before it, and this model would prove the basis for the next game, Sonic Adventure 2. This Sonic model has 2,788 tries, so it basically adds another 800 tries to the DX model. A lot of the differences between the models are actually in character design. If we take a look at Sonic's new soap shoes, they're completely different from how they looked in Sonic Adventure, and all of the detail of these soap shoes is carried masterfully by the textures. If we take a look at the wireframe for the soap shoes, we can see they're actually very basically modeled. But this is one of my favorite examples of how modeling and textures can work together to create something detailed. Sonic himself isn't actually that different from the DX model in Sonic Adventure, but that's not to say it's a direct copy and paste of that model. It is a completely remodeled character. Although honestly, I'm struggling to find where those extra 800 polygons were used. As a side note to this, if we add on all the upgrades for Sonic in the game, this boosts Sonic's overall on-screen poly count to 3,090 tries. So does that mean that Sonic Adventure 2 performs better as a game without Sonic having any upgrades? Who knows? The next model we're going to take a look at is from 2003's Sonic Heroes. At 2,396 tries, it's somewhere in between Sonic Adventure DX's Sonic model and Sonic Adventure 2's model. but for some reason, and in my opinion, it doesn't look anywhere as nice as those two models. I'm not able to put my finger on it, but I just never liked this model. But this is the first time they modeled the buckle on Sonic's shoe, so that deserves a round of applause, I guess. Sonic's ears appeared to be pointy again, which is weird because in Sonic Adventure DX and Sonic Adventure 2, his ears are more rounded. Maybe that's why I don't like this model. Although this is a good time to mention I've always been impressed with the way they modeled the back of Sonic's head. Having tried to model this myself, I understand just how difficult it is. It's a very varied bunch of shapes, and to get it right is difficult, so I'll always commend Sega for that. The hands in the Sonic Heroes model seem to be a bit more basic. Maybe that's where they lost the polygons. Maybe they realized they didn't need as many in the hands? I'm not sure. This was the last main Sonic model of that generation, so let's move on to the next generation, and I think you all know what's coming. Yeah, Sonic 06. Now this version of Sonic is one of the most drastic character design changes up to that point, and despite what people think about the actual game that this model was in, the model itself is actually really well made. At 7,508 tries, we've actually jumped up quite a way in poly count, and all these extra polygons make Sonic appear more rounded. Sonic's shoes not only have the buckle modeled like it was in Sonic Heroes, but also the soles have some detail too. With Sonic 06 being a more story-oriented game, this Sonic model was built for animated cutscenes which illustrate that story. This also means Sonic's face needs a lot of polygons so they can get decent animation. Sonic's hands would also get that same kind of treatment as they're very expressive. In the previous Sonic models, you may have noticed usually they just handle Sonic's eyes with textures. Sometimes it'll be a flat texture, or other times it'll be a modeled oval with a green Sonic eye texture. They then just move that model around the whites of Sonic's eyes. It's kinda weird when you think about it. In later games, they would just use a texture instead of any modeling on the eye. I love what they did modeling wise with this Sonic, but design wise, not so much. I think now would be a good time to move on. The next two games we're going to look at are Sonic and the Secret Rings and Sonic and the Black Knight. The reason for this is they're basically the same model, except there are a few changes. First off, let's take a look at Sonic and the Secret Rings. Now for this design of Sonic, they went back to the modern style we know today. And at 3,572 tries, we've actually gone backwards in polygon count. That does make sense as we're now back on the Wii, which is comparably less powerful than the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3. Having come off the back of Sonic 06, they're now solidifying the design that's modern Sonic, which we know today. Because of the lower polygon count of this model, the hands are noticeably less polygon heavy. But when you consider this is about 1,000 more polygons than we saw in the Sonic Adventure 2 Sonic model, this is actually a really well-rounded and nicely designed model. As mentioned before, the eyes this time round are simply just a texture, and that texture has an alpha map, which means it doesn't interfere with the whites of Sonic's eyes. This model also has a separate pair of eyelids, which means you can give Sonic this expression, which I think sums up just how most people feel about this game. The observant among you will have noticed Sonic's ring on his right hand. Well, if we move on to the Sonic and the Black Knight Sonic model, you'll notice that Sonic's right hand is completely different. Also noteworthy is this model is 75 tries less than the Sonic and the Secret Rings model. So from that, I can only assume that it takes 75 less tries to make Sonic's right hand in Sonic and the Black Knight. But I have to say, look at this thing. This is another great example of how textures can be used to emphasize a model. It's just beautifully done. Another great part of this model is Sonic's sword that's used in the game, and that is also another great blend of texture and model. Turning on the wireframe, you can see how both of these separate elements are very simple in their construction, but the texture adds so much detail it makes it look very complicated. I love stuff like this in 3D. It's what makes looking at these models so compelling. Before we move on to the next game, it's also worth mentioning that Sonic and the Secret Rings has a lower poly version of Sonic used in the game. It's made up of 996 tries, which is only 3 tries more than the original Sonic Adventure model. However, that model didn't have sandbags for hands. Would it have killed them to make them more like hands? These are more like Super Mario 64 hands. And I'm not even sure what's going on with the spikes at the back of his head, but okay, let's move on. The next game in the series is Sonic Unleashed, and as polarizing as this game can be, it's actually got one of the most well-made Sonic models in the entire series. It's made of a staggering 19,887 tries, making it the highest polygon count Sonic model to this day. No other Sonic model even comes close to this amount of tries, but it does use polygons in an excessive and questionable way. For instance, if we look at the area around Sonic's cuffs, there seems to be a ton of polygons here for not much reason. The hands I can completely understand having a ton of polygons, and the same goes with the face. Speaking of Sonic's face, there's actually a mouth model inside his muzzle. This model is borderline movie quality. I mean, the cutscenes in Sonic Unleashed were incredible. It's just a really well-made model and has to be one of my favorites. But there's also a Wii version of Sonic Unleashed, so let's take a look at that Sonic model. Now, the Wii version takes a significant dive in polygon count, which is completely expected. At 3,862, there's only about 300 more tries than we saw in Sonic and the Secret Rings and the Black Knight. However, this is actually a really nice model. The hands are reasonably detailed and nothing's over-excessive. With this model, Sonic also does something that we saw with Super Mario Galaxy in the first episode. Sonic has a range of different hand poses that can be swapped out during gameplay. There's even another mouth featuring Sonic's cheeky smile. Another thing you'll notice is if we turn on the wireframe that Sonic's eyes are modeled again and not just textures. While not quite as beautiful as its big brother on the next-gen consoles, this is still a very interesting Sonic model. The next game on the list is Sonic Colors. Made up of 4,900 tries, this is the biggest Sonic model on the Nintendo Wii. But what's impressive about this is it looks just as good as the Sonic Unleashed model used on next-gen consoles. So when we looked at that Sonic Unleashed model and I said it used polygons in excess, well, this is kind of what I meant. This model uses roughly a third of that model's polygon count, but still manages to animate incredibly well during cutscenes. If the lighting was as good in Sonic Colors as it was in Sonic Unleashed, I honestly don't think you'd have noticed any difference. There's not honestly a lot more to say about this Sonic model, so let's move on to the next two games. First off, there's Sonic Generations, which boosts Sonic's polygon count way up again. This model is 16,173 tries, so roughly 3,000 tries less than the one in Sonic Unleashed, but still has the excessive amount of polygons around Sonic's cuffs on his gloves. I just don't get it. This model also has a flipped version of Sonic's mouth. They'd swap out Sonic's mouth depending on which side was facing the camera. It's a clever little trick that stops Sonic being modeled so his mouth is in the center of his face. This is something more in tune with Sonic's character design, and it just looks better. Whenever you've seen it in other games where his mouth is in the middle, it just looks kind of weird. This model also has separate eyelids for whenever Sonic blinks. Between Sonic Unleashed, Sonic Colors, and Sonic Generations, there are so few changes between each model. They all look roughly the same, but attuned to the hardware they'd be played on. But we all know this isn't the only Sonic model in Sonic Generations. Everyone say hi to Classic Sonic. This model is particularly interesting because it's the first time we've seen the classic Sonic design properly in 3D. And the impressive thing about it is it manages to be 2,000 tries more than the modern Sonic model in the same game. I don't know why I was so surprised by that, it just struck me as a smaller character having less tries. But no, it's the opposite way around. This is absolutely my favorite Sonic model purely because it demonstrates just how great Sonic's design was in the first place. Just looking at this brings back so many memories of those original games, even though they weren't in 3D. It's a seriously clean, very expressive model too. It was used in the cutscene, so it'd have to be. There are a ton of polygons running the length of Sonic's arms and legs purely based on Sonic's original design. His arms and legs would need to bend almost like a pipe to pull off some of those classic poses. Having a ton of polygons in these areas ensures that you get a nice clean curve. Another cool thing about this model is yet again they had to use different mouth poses to pull off some of those classic moments. There's a mouth pose for when he dies or when he inhales an air bubble, and there's also a flip version of the mouth, the same as we saw with the modern model. Honestly, I could gush about this model all day, but we need to move on. Let's very briefly talk about Sonic Lost World. This model is basically the same one as used in Sonic Generations, plus 127 more tries. And I have absolutely no idea where those extra tries were spent, but basically, yeah, it's the same as the Sonic Generations model, so let's move on to, finally, the Sonic game everybody loves, Sonic Boom. Now this is the most radical change in Sonic's design in the entire series. Love it, hate it, or just think it's not Sonic, this is actually a really good model. It's made up of 9,010 tries, and it's actually very conservative where it needs to be. If you've been paying attention across the Sonic models we've already seen, you'll have noticed how many polygons usually run along the arms and the legs. They usually spend a ton of polygons in those areas just so they get nice bends out of Sonic's arms and Sonic's legs. Here, not so much. They've basically used a lot of polygons polygons around joints, but not necessarily the whole arm. Having such a low poly count for a Wii U game is actually quite impressive, even with all the bandages and neck scarves. The bandages are all handled using textures. They only elaborate using geometry anytime something is very raised, like the cuffs or the socks around Sonic's shoes. I gotta say that if this was supposed to be any other character than Sonic, I actually don't mind this design. The bandages, for my money, just don't really make much sense, but everything else is okay, yes, including the scarf. However, Sonic's mouth has returned to the center of his face. It's something we hadn't seen since Sonic 06, and really, I hoped we'd moved on from that. So as far as main Sonic titles go, well, this is where we're up to now, Sonic Boom. But don't worry, I think I can see the blue blur speeding on the horizon. Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to episode 2 of Low Poly. If you want to see more of this kind of stuff, don't forget to check out episode 1 on Super Mario. Don't forget you can follow me on Twitter or on Instagram, where I usually post little sneak peeks of things I'm working on. It's a great way for you guys to keep up to date with the channel and everything that's happening with this show. And as always, a huge thanks to everybody who supports the Patreon. You guys are the ones that make it all possible.